So tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we will be reacting to the recent Bill Maher appearance on Joe Rogan's podcast. And the reason why I found this to be very interesting is because I think this is a really good teaching moment for conservatives in the sense that I already know what's going to happen. I've basically seen this first, but I virtually guarantee you that many conservative organizations and media groups and commentators out there will be kind of clipping this interview and showing you, hey, look, Bill Maher calling out the anti-woke left, this or that. And I think it's a very good teaching moment in terms of, I think, how we as conservatives should actually respond and actually view sort of the phenomenon of the anti-woke leftist or the disaffected liberal. Because frankly, I know that the natural conservative tendency will be to coalition build, which is basically to say, hey, look, they're against cancel culture. They're against wokeness broadly. Now, they're not for social conservatism. Keep that in mind. Okay, these people are still very, very liberal in terms of compared to where we should be on social issues. But it's like, they're anti-woke, they're kind of pro-free speech or whatever, and that's enough. I know the natural tendency is to say, hey, we should caucus with these people. We should build a coalition. 2022, it's going to be the anti-woke liberals and the conservatives forming together to elect Republicans, etc. I am going to say that I am very cautious, very skeptical, and frankly, very against this concept of a coalition. Before I continue on that, let me just say I already know what your counter arguments are going to be. People are going to say, your whole big tent thinking. I know people are going to say, well, you don't understand how to build a political coalition. Not true. Or, we need people to vote for us in elections, don't we? How is this electable, this or that? I will just say that I have already heard all these arguments before. Okay, so maybe wait till the end, watch the rest of the stream before you just come at me immediately with that stuff. But we'll get into it. I think we'll kind of we'll watch this. We'll go along. We'll kind of give those takes. But the first thing, principally, I will say, and the first kind of piece I will throw at you is the fact that as much as you may look at the left today and say, well, now the left has gone so crazy, because that's kind of the natural phenomenon we're seeing. A lot of people who allied with the left, who were liberals, who were Democrats for so many years, now think the whole thing has gone too far. And now they're suddenly like, hey, now wait a minute. Okay. Now, you may look at this nowadays and say, well, the left has never been this crazy, but that's actually not true. We've actually seen this phenomenon before in history, and it was during the 1960s, right? During the 1960s, as we know, and you may look back, I know there's this perception that the hippies in the 60s and all these like campus liberal movements were just for free speech or whatever. They just wanted free speech and weed, and that's all they wanted. That's actually not true. If you go back and look at most of the campus movements, most of the liberal social movements from the 1960s, what you'll find is that they were actually incredibly radical. In many or most cases, they were just as radical. They're just as extreme as they were today. You can make a case at some points they were actually more radical than some of the left-wing movements you see today. But we saw the same exact phenomenon in the 1960s. They were deemed disaffected liberals. And actually, I don't know how many people actually remember this. Maybe our boomers in the audience will kind of recall this faintly, but that is actually the original origins of neoconservatism, okay? So the original neocons, the neocons that we hate today, that we accuse of subverting the conservative movement, the George Bushes, the Irving Kristols, the Bill Kristols, this entire ideology originally descended, let us remember, from 1960s disaffected liberals who were like, hey, I'm a liberal. I'm not really much of a conservative. Irving Kristol said as much. Irving Kristol literally openly said that his goal was to basically take what conservatism currently was and change it. And in his words, he wanted to erase the current model of conservatism, and you can look this up. He said this outright, change it into a political ideology that is capable of governing a 20th century democracy. And it's like, what does that mean? Well, what it basically means is, just take conservatism and totally astroturf it. And we've literally seen that phenomenon happen. And so, look, here's the deal with the neocons. They were kind of effective for us for a little bit. Neocons were a pivotal part, supposedly, in the Reagan Revolution, right? They helped us elect Reagan. They helped Reagan win 2 terms by overwhelming margins. But we've seen since what they have done. And looking back, you have to ask the question, was it really worth it to allow neocons, the disaffected liberals of the 1960s, to join the conservative tent? I think most Trump supporters out there would give an overwhelming no. Like, in retrospect, yes, they gave a few more votes to Ronald Reagan or whatever, but in retrospect, they actually killed the conservative movement. They actually astroturfed us away from being politically effective, this and that. And it's like, okay, understanding that and understanding in many ways their subversion of the conservative movement actually grew us into a politically ineffective force, right? Understanding that, my question is, how can we really realistically fall for the same thing today? Okay, I'm too smart for that. I'm too much of a big-brained Asian man for that, okay? I see exactly the same thing happening today. This tendency to say, hey, look how far the left has gone. Don't you want these rational liberals within your tent? This is literally where the original neocons came from. I would say that what you're seeing today is the phenomenon of like the neocon, because they're the new neocons, right? So we call them the neocons, whatever. And I'm just warning you right now. Look, I bet you no one's going to listen. I virtually guarantee you no one's going to listen to us if they're going to go full steam ahead. I virtually guarantee you 20 years from now, when the country is even more destroyed than it is now, I will look back and say, I was vindicated. Okay, I was vindicated. I told you not to let these people into the tent. You did it anyway. You were so greedy for a few votes in this election that you did not consider the long-term health of what this would do to your political movement. And I guarantee I will be vindicated at that point. But for now, folks, we will react to this. We'll react to Bill Maher kind of calling out the anti-woke left, and I will kind of respond. So let's get started here, all right? And this is on the Joe Rogan Experience again.
Well, I think that's because we are both seen as people who are sort of like commonsensical. And that is what there is a hunger for, I think.
Again, reminder, right? Irving Kristol, the neocons of the 1960s, or as they were called back then, the new conservatives or the disaffected liberals, they said the exact same thing. Okay, so the people who gave you George Bush, who gave you the Iraq War, who gave you global free trade conservatism, who gave you everything that destroyed this country, and in many ways is the reason is what Trumpism was a rebellion against. Reminder, in the 1960s, these people were saying the exact same thing. As much as you think this is a new phenomenon, again, the left has gotten so crazy now. We've seen this before in history. The same exact thing is happening. You get the same exact result. But here's Bill Maher.
In America, more than anything, is common sense.
Yes.
Away from the extremes. I mean, when people say to me, don't you think you've gotten more conservative? No, I haven't. The left has gotten goofier.
Yes.
So I seem more conservative, maybe, but like, it's not me who changed.
Yes.
I feel I'm the same guy, but 5 years ago, we hadn't spent $6 trillion to stay home. I mean, I understand we had to do something with the pandemic. I'm not sure that was, I remember when $1 trillion was too much to spend on anything. We didn't spend $1 trillion to bail out the economy in 2000.
See, here's the thing, and here's what I'll say is that, listen specifically to what Bill Maher just said, okay? He admits it. Now, many of these disaffected liberal types, they're not as honest as Bill Maher is about it, okay? They'll stay kind of vague. They'll actually stay more ambiguous about it. But what Bill Maher basically told you is that he's not ideologically changed a bit. He's still the same guy he was in 2000 in the 1990s, which is a liberal, a more moderate liberal than kind of the modern left, sure, but still a liberal. And basically all he wants to return to is that left wing of old. Well, my response to that, and my response to Bill Maher and anyone who kind of feels that they're in the disaffected liberal camp would be, is that, look, I understand your sentiment. I understand that, like, hey, I believe this. I used to be this type of liberal. Now they've gone further past me. But what I would also say is that it's important for you to understand, it's important for all these like disaffected liberals to understand that your ideology enabled and was always bound to descend into like leftism, like liberalism, quote unquote, was always bound to descend into leftism. And the truth is, the point that you start eroding tradition a little bit, the point that you start eroding traditional standards and kind of objective God-based standards on morality and other such things, and just for a little bit of liberation, well, once you open the floodgates to that, once you open the floodgates to what is essentially poison, I would argue, what is essentially cancer, once you start to open that, what you get is like, what does cancer do? It spreads. What does poison do when it enters your body? It spreads, right? And so what I would say, my primary message to kind of these disaffected liberals is not necessarily just, hey, screw you, I don't want you. I want you, but I want you to be a conservative. And I think that's the only, what your duty is. Okay, here's the deal. It is not the duty of conservatives to move left. Okay, it's not the duty of conservatives to say, hey, you're kind of an old school liberal. Let's move left so that we can be friends. It's actually the duty of the liberals to wake up and realize, hey, my original ideas were always bound to descend into leftism, right? And I would argue, right, in many ways, the original liberals, people like Bill Maher, kind of like the moderate liberals, the disaffected left, in many ways were essentially always useful idiots for the left, right? They've always been that. The left has always used them and exploited them and kind of carried them along because they understood that they needed the coalition. And now that they're in such a place of institutional power, what you're seeing is the left is like, okay, well, we have no need for you guys. Either you guys get in or move out, right? And so that's what I would say, right? That's what I would say to disaffected liberals. Because people say, what do you do with them then? They kind of want to be your friend. Well, again, what I will say is not just get out of here. What I will say is, no, you're welcome here if you recognize that your original ideas were always bound to lead into the current ideas, which they were, and they were set up by design to do that, I would argue, right? And you become an authentic conservative as a result of realizing what your ideas have led to, right? That is the true waking up moment, right? That is the true walk away moment, I would argue. The walk away moment is not like, oh, I'm a liberal, but I think the left has gone too far, and I just want to be an original liberal. No, the waking up moment is not being an original liberal. The waking up moment is being a conservative. If you're not willing to wake up to being a conservative, right, then I would argue there is no place for you. And, I think your influence will be subversive. And that's why I would say to someone like Bill Maher, and I understand that someone like Bill Maher is very unlikely to actually become a real conservative by any stretch of the imagination. But in terms of what do we do with these people? What do we do with these ideas? That's what I would say. That's what I would point out.
2008. So we didn't do that. 5 years ago, no one was talking about abolishing the police. There was no talk about
right, but you people were coddling extremists. Okay, like, BLM's gone so crazy. Yeah, well, who enabled BLM? Who let BLM into the Overton window to begin with? Who propped up BLM? Who shielded for the original lies with Michael Brown and all that enabled the current BLM movement of today to get as crazy as it did? Who gave Black Lives Matter such a high degree of credibility? It was people like Bill Maher, right? It was these moderate liberals. It was the liberal establishment, and that's what they did. I would argue that was always their plan, right? But if Bill Maher is going to stand here and pretend like that was not his intention, well, what I would say to someone like Bill Maher, someone who is genuinely kind of dumbfounded by what the left has become, I would look to you and say, look, your original kind of setup in which you were fighting for was always bound to open the floodgates to this stuff. And it's not a viable solution to just say, hey, can we turn the clock back like 5 to 10 years? Because what's going to happen? You turn it back 5 to 10 years, you're going to get 5 to 10 years later, the same exact thing, because your ideas were always destined to lead to this stuff. That's what liberals need to understand. They need to understand their ideology is foundationally flawed. It's not just like, oh, well, we had good ideas, but now they've gone too far. And that's what you'll see from a lot of conservative organizations out there. That's the argument that they'll make, right? You'll see like these 5-minute videos about how, well, here's what real tolerance is about. No. The real problem is that liberal ideas are foundationally flawed, and that's why they've gotten here. It's not that like, oh, they got hijacked by bad actors or they just went too far. No, their ideas are foundationally flawed. And again, Bill Maher liberalism is always bound to lead to, I don't know, critical race theory liberalism or whatever you want to call it,
pregnant men, there was looting was still illegal, right?
Here's another example, right? Yeah, looting was still illegal, but people like Bill Maher were advocating for like criminal justice reform and defending the BLM cause and things like that. And again, opening the floodgates to all the things that make looting illegal, abolishing the police, and etc. And instead of saying, there's no humility there, right? Because like, instead of looking back and saying, well, that was a mistake on my part, I should have never gone on board with that. No, instead they're like, you know what? They're just too far. And there's no self-reflection here, which I think is necessary for someone like Bill Maher,
Isn't that crazy?
Have I changed? No, because if someone had said 20 years ago, I'm not sure looting is a bad thing, I would have opposed it then.
Yeah.
So I haven't changed. But that, I think, is what there is this hunger for, is this sort of common sense. Centrism is such a wishy-washy word, but that's sort of what it is. Some people lean a little more to the left, a little more to the right. Sometimes it's issue by issue. But just, I'm always saying to the Democrats, just don't be the party of no common sense. And you will be surprised at how much amazing success you will have, as opposed to.
So I can, number one, like this concept of centrism, and I'm going to reiterate this again, is like, if you're not willing to take a hardline stance against this stuff at its origin, centrism is not going to solve the problem. You know, you look at something like, well, they're pedophiles are grooming our children. Look at the sexual propaganda being taught to our children, you know, and they're trying to make our kids this and that. And it's like, that's absolutely true. But if your solution to that is just to go back to like 3 years before, that's not going to work. What you need to do is take a full stand against the entire sexual revolution, right? On alphabet issues, we need to be honest enough to look back and say, no, the problem with this and where this all started was the legalization of same-sex marriage, right? The second that we stood and said, love and marriage is not between a man and a woman, but it's whatever you want it to be, you know, do you. That's where this all started. Like that, the moment you open up that floodgate, which is wrong, by the way, which is untrue. Marriage is absolutely between a man and a woman. And that's an objective traditional standard that governed Western society for, I don't know, some like 1500 years, right? The moment you open those floodgates, that's where you're going to end up, right? Centrism, the centrist response of saying, well, I was fine with them letting them marry. I was even fine with the corporate propaganda and shoving that propaganda, but let's just keep that propaganda to like 10 years old and up and whatnot. That's not a viable response. That's not a sensible response. It really stands on nothing, and it's not going to do anything, right? All you're going to do is maybe delay the march of the left by about 2 to 3 years. It is not a viable solution to actually reversing any of the stuff you see today. And so that's the thing I would say, number one. And then the other thing I would say, number two, listen to what Bill Maher said, right? What he basically said is, well, if Democrats moderate up a little bit, they'll do a lot more to win. And I would argue in many ways that basically reveals his true intentions. I would argue, and in some ways they're underhanded, but it's like, you know, Bill Maher's still going to vote Democrat or whatever. I think in a sense, he almost thinks in a way, I would say that this is the way Bill Maher thinks. I don't even know if Bill Maher necessarily disagrees with any of the things that the left is doing right now. I think it's more or less that he just thinks that the American public isn't ready for it, right? He's like, well, right now, I don't think the Democrats are electable on this message, right? I think Bill Maher in many ways just wants more of like an incremental liberalism instead of a radical leftism, because he doesn't think that voters in the American public are necessarily ready for this, but with decades more of conditioning, we'll get there. I would argue, he doesn't say it outright, but I would argue that's kind of the core more so of what Bill Maher is thinking, okay? Which, I mean, should you trust that? No, you shouldn't trust that, because it's very clear what he's doing. We're still going to get the same place. And I would argue in some ways that's more effective, right? It's more effective to kind of condition people over time than to throw it all in their face at once. And I think in many ways, what Bill Maher is essentially saying is, look, I agree with all these things. Let's just not show our hand all at once. And what conservatives will do is, instead of saying, look at this subversion going on, hey, look, even the moderate people are not on your side. Look at what the moderates are trying to do. They're working in bed with the left in many ways. No, what they're going to do is they're going to clip this. They're going to take this clip. They're going to put it on IGTV. They're going to share it all over Instagram and whatnot. And they're going to be like, look, even Bill Maher is calling out the left. And it's like, why is he doing that? And I would argue to an extent, again, I'm not saying I can prove that this is his intention, but kind of reading between the lines of what he's saying, I think in many ways, he's more so giving the left kind of what he thinks is an effective strategy rather than saying, I genuinely oppose this stuff. You see what I'm saying?
What's going to happen, which is they're going to get their ass kicked in November.
Well, people like you are very important to people like me, because you represent what it means to me to be liberal, what it means to me to be left-wing. Because you're just a normal person who cares about people's rights and wants a certain amount of freedom and wants people to get along and work things out amicably.
Right.
But the polarization in this country has made it so that people like you are rare. It's weird. It's like, that's what I used to think of when I thought of the left. I thought of like professors and, you know, intellectuals and these people that would sit down and work through things with the understanding that free speech is like one of the most important aspects of communication possible, and communication is everything.
See, well, okay, first of all, those who genuinely did feel like, oh, I'm a free speech liberal, number one, you were always a useful idiot. That's what you really were, like, fundamentally. Like, free speech liberals were always fundamentally useful idiots for the radical left. The radical left used them. I shouldn't even say radical left. I should just be saying the left. But the left use them essentially as kind of like props. You know what I mean? Useful idiots, as Lenin talks about. So that's number one. And then number two, I think it's also important to understand that the entire free speech kind of tolerance line, you know, is never something the left genuinely believed. It was more so kind of a reflection of their lack of institutional power. So what do you do when you're being kind of cracked down on by the system and you don't control the system? We say, well, we just want free speech. We just want the freedom to spread our idiot, degenerate ideas around to the society, and then just leave us alone. Just give us free speech. But what you're obviously seeing now is, now that they have done that, now that they've convinced kind of the masses of their plans and they've taken over the institutions, now what you're seeing is a total lack of free speech, being very anti-free speech. Now they made up this whole standard of hate speech, obviously, and it's like, that was always the plan. You know, that was always the intention. And I think in many ways, it's just what you have. What this misunderstanding that someone like Joe Rogan has fundamentally is a reflection of just not being smart enough, or just not being like awake enough to realize that, you know, this was kind of what was going on the whole time, you know? So
communication is how we work things out. Like this idea of not talking to people you disagree with. Well, guess what? That just galvanizes them. They just get hardened and they move further and further away. And we get more and more associated with this idea of left and right, and good and bad, and 1 and 0. And this side does not agree with anything that side says. That's crazy.
It's not crazy though. Like, let's be honest, it's really not crazy, okay? And I know, I guess I'm exactly what Joe Rogan is like bashing, he's condemning, but it's very true that, like, I fundamentally, as a Christian and as a conservative, I fundamentally see what's going on as like a battle of good and evil. You know, like that's really what it is. There is a good side and there's an evil side. You know, I guess there is technically a side that doesn't really know what's going on, but in the end, they will ultimately either be a pawn for the good side or the evil side. But that's fundamentally how I see politics, especially the battle between like Christian conservatism and godless leftism. You know, that's all that there is to it. Like, it really is that black and white. And yeah, you may be in the middle. You may not know what's going on, but, you know, ultimately what's going on affects you. And ultimately, like, whatever you're doing is going to be a pawn for the good side, or it's going to help the evil side. Like, it really is that black and white, you know? And maybe that comes from my worldview. That comes from the way I kind of view the world and my religion and whatnot. But it is very true. Like, I do see it as a battle between good and evil. And this like, I kind of have been debunking the whole centrist approach this whole time, but this whole idea that it's really anything different than that, you know, is just not true.
It doesn't make any sense. And if you're out there doing it, it gives people hope. And it's not just where you're saying common sense. You do have common sense, but more importantly, you have courage, because courage allows you to speak your mind, whether you're right or wrong. Courage allows you to take a chance, and you're seeing the wave of people that are moving in a certain direction. It doesn't necessarily make sense. And you're like, hey, what the fuck is going on? And everybody's like, finally, someone's saying it on TV. Because maybe someone said it at a cocktail party, maybe someone said it at a barbecue, but they're not fucking saying it on HBO until you say it on HBO.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I mean,
it means a lot.
I always say, you know, there's levels of courage. There's like, yeah, I mean, I will take that compliment, as long as I can also say, but there's like Marines level.
Yeah, you know.
Yeah, but you know, Bill Maher is so brave. You know, he's on HBO. He's so brave. He occasionally says things that get bad press from the Daily Beast. Okay, not kidding about that, by the way. I kind of like Googled Bill Maher's name as an experiment before the stream, and the very worst that's being said about him is like the Daily Beast is calling him a misogynist or something like that. Yeah, you're so brave, dude. You know. Meanwhile, we out here, we're being called white nationalists by the Washington Post. And I'm not saying I actually am called a white nationalist by the Washington Post, but regardless, like, you know, like conservatives are getting the brunt of so much, right? And we're literally blacklisted by the institutions. We're not allowed on so many social media platforms, all this stuff. No, the real brave one is the liberal who gets out here with minor pushback by the left and kind of calls out a little bit of common sense. No. You know who's brave? You know who's brave? Who's brave is the Christian conservative who's willing to stand against all of the institutions and say, nope, I believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. Like, that's the brave one. Abortion is murder. That's the brave one. You know, the brave one is not the disaffected liberal who, oh, he got bad articles by the Daily Beast, so he's brave. Bill Maher is not really all that brave.
You're not a
Okay.
Navy SEAL. Absolutely.
No, exactly.
You're not even a woman about to give birth.
I'm in the D League.
Yes.
In the D League,
Like we wouldn't be allowed to have a show on HBO, you know?
I have a lot of courage, but I'm
Well,
not playing in the upper league.
What you have
But-
is honesty.
But thank you. Yes,
You have honesty.
well,
and
it's-
and
it's
people
so
know
true.
that, and that's
Right.
why your show works.
and that's also I always feel like what my bond with the audience is. Like, you
Yes.
don't have. When I started way back on Politically Incorrect, almost 30 years ago, people said, this show will never work because a TV host can never reveal his politics. I mean, Johnny Carson never
Right.
did. Leno did.
Politically incorrect.
Letterman, they never said. "I'm going
He's
to
so
this."
politically
Whereas,
incorrect.
I mean, you obviously know who all the late night hosts are for now.
Right.
I mean, it's a completely one-sided thing. They have to pander to the liberal audience, which watches them. It's so reverse of when I started,
It's bonkers.
when you couldn't be political, and now you couldn't survive apparently in late night television unless you are political, unless the audience knows exactly that you're. And I would put Saturday Night Live in this
That's a reflection of the long march of the left. I don't understand that, you know?
too. It's I think Elon Musk took them to task.
It's
He said
true.
It doesn't seem like a show that's about comedy anymore, so much as it is about declaring some woke doctrine.
Yeah.
And having the people who go to those shows and are in there, I guess, where they film them and stuff. My audience was too doctrinated for a while. We have a much better audience now because we kind of got rid of the groaners, the people for whom I was always too politically incorrect. And I was like, I've been doing this forever. The names of the shows, Politically Incorrect, Real Time, and you still come to this show and groan when I say something too real? What fucking show did you think you were coming to? Because they do film The Price is Right in the same studio.
Do you think that the way it's going right now with late night television, where everyone has to be political, is that what?
Politically incorrect, okay? Bill Maher is he's so politically incorrect. Dude, you know what this really said? Like, I most conservatives are watching this like, what the heck are you talking about? Like, yeah, you're better. I guess you're better than a lot of the other late night shows in terms of your political incorrectness. But it's like, you compare the stuff he says versus like, what kind of the conservative movement is today. It's like, no, we are the counterculture, You lame anti-woke liberals don't go, oh, I'm different. I'm a little bit edgy, I'm a Redditor, I don't think the birds are real. You guys are lame. We're the real counterculture. It's true.
What the audience wants, or is that what the executives in the studio wants? Are they like, are they one step behind? Like, where is the mandate coming from? Is it the person who's the host who says, what I know works in this town? If I want to keep working, I have to be like outwardly left-leaning, progressive, political.
Look, I think it's coming from both because corporations in America now are
They're leaning in.
Or
They're
what?
leaning into woke. Hardcore.
They're petrified
Yeah.
of some kind of backlash. I mean, you see with Disney now. I mean, Disney, one of the most gay-friendly companies that we've had in a very long time, as they should be. All companies should be gay-friendly, but Disney sort of had gay.
So there you go. There's his like true liberalism coming out, right? And so, he obviously won't acknowledge how what he supports leads to what he doesn't support, but
Gay days
Yeah.
at Disney. What is it? World, Land? I don't know. I'm not a Disney.
I think it was the LA one, right?
You never
I
find
think
me
it's
in it.
Land.
Disneyland is the original. That's right.
That's
Disney
LA.
World is in Florida.
Right.
You'll never find me sitting in a teacup, Joe. Okay, so
I love teacups.
I mean, this is in my category of things that only children used to do that now adults do. I mean, if I had a nickel for every time somebody said, I'm going to Disneyland, and I'm like, with your kids? No, we're just going.
Ah.
Okay, but there is that. There is.
unironically, that's unironically like a subtly based take by Bill Maher, I will admit. Okay. And not to like show for the guy or anything, but it is very true that we have a pandemic of overgrown children in society, and it's very true. Like these like grown men and women and stuff. You have these like women in their 30s who are like, Disney, I'm gonna go to Disney World, put on the Disney ears. It's like overgrown children, and it's actually a real phenomenon in American society.
Corporations, I think, yes, are always going to want to. And look, I'm glad they are progressive thinking. Of course, like with everything on the left these days, they just take it too far. But I think
there you go, right? They just take it too far. There, see, this is what I'm talking about. There's no fundamental understanding of how it came to be that far. There's no fundamental understanding of the slippery slope. And this is actually very true. I think something I should bring up is that liberals live in the present, right? Liberals, in many ways, you would argue, in liberal philosophy, has no understanding of the past or the future. It's basically just live for the present, okay? That's why they're humanists. That's why many of them are materialistic atheists. That's why many of them are hedonists, right? Because the philosophy is fundamentally founded on live for the present. You don't live understanding yesterday or live for tomorrow and live for tomorrow, for the betterment of tomorrow, which is the conservative way of life. No, the liberal way of life is to live for today. And so it really should make sense that a liberal-minded person cannot comprehend the slippery slope, right? Because liberals don't look backwards to history, and they don't have the foresight to look forward at things. Again, it's a philosophy grounded in living in the present, okay? The conservative looks back and says, gone too far. Well, we were marching to this whole point the whole way, and you were going along supporting it the whole time. And you basically let the cat out of the bag, and here we are now. That's what the real conservative says, and that's what the conservative understands. The liberal, as compared to the leftist, the liberal is just like, the leftist is just like, well, this is what we've always wanted. Ha, you stupid liberal. We brought you along, and look at where you are now. And you're not going to go over to Trump. You're not going to go over the crazy Republicans. So I don't care how much you complain. You're still going to caucus with us, which is absolutely true, by the way. Bill Maher is still going to vote Democrat. He's still going to kind of ultimately fall in line with the left when it's necessary, right? But, the liberal just looks back and is like, well, how did this happen? Why is this happening today? It's true.
it's coming from the audience more, because the audience who goes to a taping of Saturday Night Live or a show like that, they're youngish, and they believe what they believe. A lot of the things I also believe.
There you go.
But it's sort of an unexamined, like, they don't know too much about politics. They just know that, and again, you mentioned Trump doing this, like he was so awful that it's just very easy to turn off to the details and go, well, I'm with the Democrats and the left.
I mean, in many ways, I think Bill Maher basically just admits who he is in this clip. Well, actually, let's go to the second clip. We'll just watch this and kind of react to the rest of it. So let me go. There's like a second clip here. There we go.
The Joe Rogan Experience.
I mean, I say this all the time because the percentage of graft keeps getting higher and higher.
Right, exactly.
Now, we found out recently that something like, I'm going to get the number wrong. Maybe you can look it up on your magic light box, but
SNL is a boomer show. That's also true. Bill's take on that is just wrong. The people who go to SNL tapings are like stupid. In most cases, they're like just very cringe, wine mom, divorced, in many cases divorced, boomer women. Okay, I think that's the way I would, not boomer women, like Gen X liberal women. That's usually who you get SNL tapings, who are frankly just the worst. Pretentious liberal moms are among the most pretentious types of moms. They are the most pretentious types of moms. But yeah, those are the types that obviously can't take a joke. Women in general, you could argue, are not the best at taking jokes, but still, regardless, especially liberal-minded wine moms. Very true. But I mean, honestly, realistically, I don't think, it's just the audience is liberal. They just want to make the audience laugh. That's a bad take. It goes much deeper than that. It goes to the fact that, the left literally controls the institutions. They control the corporations. It's not corporations who are scared of the left, right? That was Bill Maher's take. Bill Maher's take is like, corporations are just scared of the social left. No, the social left runs corporations, okay? Disney's a prime example of this. And their ideology absolutely, it's not like they're scared of the ideology. The ideology controls the corporations, right? But as a liberal, he has to see things in this kind of state of perpetual revolution. So he doesn't really want to admit that corporations are like on his side, right? Because liberalism, he still has to give the nod to like progressive economics or whatever. When in reality, all of the corporations, all the major institutions, they're controlled by his camaraderie or whatever you want to call it. But so
like 20%, I think, of the unemployment checks we passed out during COVID were complete fraud.
A mere pittance.
The PPP.
Yeah. Oh my God. So
Well,
many
the-
people got arrested for
the-
having Lamborghinis and shit.
Right. I mean, J.K. Rowling got money.
No,
for
she
her-
didn't.
Yeah, for her Broadway show.
What?
Because if she didn't, she'd be living in her car, Joe.
She got money from that. That's hilarious.
Everybody got money.
That
Tom Brady
seems
got.
so crazy.
And like, when you look at some of the percent, and like the number for to build a house for the homeless in LA has risen to $837,000.
a mere pittance, Bill Maher. A mere pittance from these greedy
And so-
billionaires
so
out there. We need to
if
tax them all.
If I'm complaining about that, again, to your point about a Republican idea, people would say, oh, you're complaining about government spending money. And my answer is, okay, but is there any number at which point I am not tipped over into the Republican side
Right.
that I can't complain about money that is just being stolen?
Right.
I mean, I totally, as a good liberal, I totally accept the notion that, as someone once said, you cannot transfer money except with a leaky bucket. I get it. It can't be perfect. But is it not?
20%.
Is there no number for which I cannot remonstrate against
Right.
this?
I don't really care as much about this take. Like, he's just ripping on government spending. I actually basically agree with his take on this, actually, but like
20% is a low. That, I mean, it's even higher than that. That was only the unemployment checks. The PPP stuff was even higher.
That's where it's
And-
beautiful and brilliant, because they attach it to something that's like we need to help these people.
But what I would say that it reflects is more or less, again, he just wants to play the moderate. He wants to play the moderate classical liberal. In many ways, it's not good. Who's saying they took down the stream? They suspended the stream for what? What in the heck? Okay, are we back now? Okay, it looks like we're back now. I think it Are we back now? It's playing again on my end. It said, okay, let me see. I got an email. This is fair use. How dare they? Due to a copyright match, your stream was interrupted. Hold on. Your stream was interrupted. Streams are interrupted when copyrighted content is detected. After copyrighted material is no longer being streamed, streams are automatically re-enabled. What the heck? It's fair use. We were reacting to a video. What? Okay. The other state. It's not nice of them. We were almost done. We're almost done too. All right. Well, we can keep continuing the stream honestly without it, because I think like I basically played for you the significant parts. I don't know if we're gonna be able to keep the stream up after this. Actually, I don't know. Hopefully, I don't like strike it or something. But okay, I know. Whatever. We're back. We're back here. Okay. They didn't stop us. They're not gonna stop us. But to continue as to what I was saying, I'm distracted now. Elon strikes. It's true. It was probably Elon Musk. Okay, the utter trolling of him. I'll talk about him in a second, actually. But thank you, YouTube, for the censorship of this needed info. It's so true. It's so true. What is their problem? But we are back. Okay, Vince just overcame tech censorship. I literally did. Joe Rogan's going. Hey, listen here, buddy. Okay, listen here, buddy. All right. Anyways, guys, continuing on what we were talking about here. Okay, continuing on what we were talking about. So Bill Maher is Bill Maher. right? But this is a problem much bigger than Bill Maher, because Tulsi Gabbard, for instance, is a great example of this. Tulsi Gabbard, they have her speaking at CPAC, right? And you have a lot of this, right? You have like people like Karlin Borisenko. There's a lot of kind of conservative influencers and conservative commentators who have like literally presented themselves as kind of being a part of our tent. Bill Maher kind of just more so gives a nod, more or less. But again, you know, what I would say is that before we allow these people into like immediately into the Republican camp, don't forget that I copyrighted Vindicated. No, you didn't. Who said you copyrighted that? Who said you copyrighted that? Okay. But, you know, what I will reiterate, okay, you can't react to the rest of Bill Maher's thing, but what I will reiterate is again the fact, okay, is again the fact that neoconservatism, I will remind you, descends from this stuff. Okay. And so when we talk about bringing in neocons into the movement, I don't think it's a very good idea. The reason being is that, you know, inevitably you're going to see a clash happen here. Okay. Social conservatives versus social liberals, who are just in support of free speech. The question is who's going to win out. Okay. Now, inevitably, the general trend of things seems to be that instead of social conservatives converting social liberals, which sometimes happens, for the most part it doesn't. What for the most part happens is social liberals tend to convert social conservatives into the socially liberal camp. Look at the conservative movement. Look at where the Republican Party has moved on social issues, you know, over time. Because again, you know, we allowed the neocons into the tent in the 1960s. They won us in the 1980s. In the grand scheme of things, has the conservative movement and has the Republican Party moved left or right? Inevitably, as you can tell, it's moved left. Okay. And that's always what's going to happen, right? That always just seems to be what happens. Instead of allowing disaffected liberals into the tent and then, you know, converting them, right? Which is something I do support, right? We do want to grow the amount of people who are conservatives. But instead of pandering to them, I want to be able to grow the people who are conservatives authentically, like make authentic conservatives out of people, right? What you, of course, are going to get instead, that never happens. Like, when does that ever happen? Very rarely does that ever happen, okay? What you see more so, of course, is, you know, to pander, to appeal to the disaffected left, what you see instead is conservatives move left to pander to that. Okay. And that is the grand scheme of the way things march. Okay. And so I would have to say, I would rather prefer a conservative movement that is literally just effective, right? I'd rather prefer a conservative movement that actually stands for something and gets anything done, compared to basically controlled opposition, because that's what inevitably happens when you have a conservative movement that is basically just moderate liberalism, which in many cases you have seen some conservative groups even advocate for basically just moderate liberalism, right? You know, what you very often see is actually not what you very often see. Like literally just what you get is controlled opposition. Conservatives, as many say, right? Conservatism is just progressivism driving the speed limit. You have the progressives, you have the left. Here they are drifting further to the left. And then you have conservatives, quote unquote, just 5 to 10 years behind them. Well, that's not anything in the long term that's going to save this country or return this country, okay? This is not a serious political movement. We're basically just holding on for dear life. Okay, that's all we do. Is holding on for dear life. And I don't want to hold on for dear life. I want to prosper, right? I want to build. I want to create. I want to restore the greatness of America, right? I actually want to make America great again, not just like hold the line, right? I would argue, you know, in many ways, those are kind of the two lines of conservative thinking. There's make America great again, which is to say, like, actually, like, restore something, like return to something. And then there's hold the line, which is basically just stall the left as much as possible, right? They're banging on the door, they're knocking on your door, and you're just like, okay, wait a minute, you know, hey, what's that over there? Did you get that guy's door first? It's like, that's not the conservatism I want, you know, because, but you're going to lose if you do a full MAGA. Well, here's the thing, right? Either if we just are the moderate liberals, if we're progressivism driving the speed limit, we're bound to lose, right? Because 10 years later, we're going to get to the same destination. I'm not saying necessarily we are going to win saying we're going to make America great again. I'm not saying necessarily we're going to win by, you know, standing for something. Okay, there's no guarantee that that's winning, but at least there's a possibility. Because if we're just moderate liberals, if we're just progressivism driving the speed limit, it's literally guaranteed that we're going to lose. Because even if we control the 100% of the situation, 5 to 10 years later, we're just going to be exactly where the progressives were. That's a lose. That's losing. That's an L. I'm not saying that by being assertive. I'm not saying by being aggressive. I'm not saying by being authentically conservative, we're guaranteed to win. The only guarantee of victory of good versus evil is the final victory of good versus evil, right? And that is the book of Revelation. That is the day of judgment. That is God's victory over evil. That's the only guarantee, right? There is no guarantee that we here on earth will win all of our battles against evil. Okay, quite the opposite. But with that said, there is a chance, at least if we are willing to actually stand for good and not just a moderate form of evil, we have a chance. It might not be the great chance, but we have a chance at least. Because hypothetically, if we do win, we will have actually won. We will have actually restored good. If we are just a more moderate form of evil, if we just drive the speed limit of progressivism, it doesn't matter how many elections you win, you're still guaranteed to get what in the end? Progressivism, okay? So, that's number one. And honestly, to people who say that, oh, well, the Big Tent, this is not electable. You need these people to win elections, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just going to say again, this is what people said in the 1960s. Has it gotten us to a better place? Has it really? Did it work the first time? No. So why would it work the second time? And it's like, if these people want to caucus with us, that's great. Go ahead. But we shouldn't compromise our, and I would argue in many ways, if we just are pandering to the moderate left, how is that going to change the moderate left's mind about everything, about anything? They're just going to say, like the neocons did in the 60s, oh, I guess this is the new political home for us, is the Republican Party, right? At least if we are holding firm, at least we're kind of opening up the moderate left or moderate liberals to our authentic ideas. Many of them will reject them. Maybe some will come over. But if we just hide our ideas, if we just conceal our ideas, what moderate liberal is ever going to possibly have their minds change if we just move into directly what they are currently, right? We have to be trying to change people. We have to actually want to change minds, not just suck in people, right? And so that's the other thing I would say. I think that there are way better ways to build a political coalition for what? Oh, you need to build a coalition. You need to build a Big Tent. Well, what's that political coalition going to advocate for? Because frankly, I don't think just saying, oh, we're just going to advocate for free speech, tolerant liberalism. I don't think that's really advocating for anything. That's advocating for what the other side wants, right? I want a conservative political coalition. Yes, different types of people are welcome in that conservative political coalition, but the prerequisite is they have to be ideologically or philosophically conservative, and if they're not, they have to shut up and get in line. At the very least, what is this coalition supposed to advocate for? We surrender abortion, we surrender social conservative, we surrender everything, but we're for free. So we're just against cancel culture. And what is that? That coalition, part of that problem, coalitions have to fight for something. They have to want to steer things in a certain direction. That is a directionalist movement. There's no direction to that movement. There's no really goal. There's no really aim there. You grow a tent too big to the point where it becomes meaningless. It becomes totally ineffective, right? The most effective political movements in history have not really been run by huge majorities. More so, they've been run by very coordinated, very effective, very agenda-driven, minorities, right? Small groups of people who work together and who work effectively, right? Majority rule is a myth. Majority rule is a lie. No political movement, no government in history has ever really been dictated by majority rule, so much as a very small and effective minority that is willing to basically assert its will on the majority, okay? So, it's a big circus tent. It's so true. We need to be loud and proud as they are. It's very true. It is absolutely true. Vincecation Nation is inevitable. It's so true. What do you think America will look like by 2030, Vince? I have a really hard time saying, if I'm being honest, because, we could either be on the path to, realistically, I think it's going to be one or the other. Either the second term of Trump I'm not saying we'll be back. We will not be back by 2030. We won't even be close to back. But either the second term of Trump kind of has us in a more optimistic direction, or regardless of whether or not Trump wins in 2024 or not, just is saying that it's basically a failure. I think we'll either be moving towards a positive direction or on the verge of collapse. And I mean that, actually. I mean that. I think that the utter collapse of this system is a much stronger possibility than people give it credit for, right? Because I know the idea, especially when America is a country that's literally had the same government since 1787, right? Constitution, 1787. The concept of an American collapse, the concept of a Soviet-style collapse, a coup, a revolution, something, right? A civil war, a collapse of the system, American Caesar. The concept of that, obviously, I know is very outlandish to most Americans, and it sounds very schizo. Some people, a lot of times, it just sounds like boomer, Q-tard rhetoric or whatever. But the truth is that, I think in many ways you could make a case that on this current path, we are actually unironically headed towards a collapse of this system. And Pat Buchanan predicted this, actually. He didn't just say, and he points out the fact that, people in 1988 in the Soviet Union thought the imminent collapse of their system was very unlikely too. And I think that's the case with a lot of people, so, all right. Andrew M says, what are your thoughts on the left having control? Thank you for $5, by the way. He says, what are your thoughts on the left having control over so many churches? I just had a sermon this week that talked mainly about Ukraine and feminism. Well, obviously, as we know, there's going to be false teachers out there. And we definitely have a problem with, I think the church has become susceptible to the world, right? In many ways. And so, what are my thoughts on that? I would say in many ways, it's just basically symbolic of the fact that the left literally has taken over everything, right? The church, the one institution that conservatives are supposed to control, technically, I would say in many ways, we probably control still a sizable portion of it, but we don't really control it entirely as an American institution or a global institution anymore. And so, I think the Bible obviously warns about that. Many will depart from the faith. False teachers will come. Antichrist will come. But from kind of a political perspective or a cultural perspective, I think it's indicative of the fact that, the left really has taken over everything. And I think to an extent also what you have is a phenomenon of, instead of defending the gospel, right? Instead of spreading the gospel to the world, they're trying to spread the world to the gospel. They're trying to make the gospel, they're trying to make Christianity and Christ kind of palatable to mainstream society, mainstream culture, with the idea of bringing in more people into the faith. And that's not going to work. Because when you compromise the gospel, you have a gospel that does not save. When you have a gospel of social justice instead of salvation, that does you no good. Because the goal of church should be to help it seen that as many souls are saved by God as possible. That is the goal of church. That should be the goal of the church, obviously, right? But the goal of the church instead, in many cases, is to bring in as many followers as we can, have these big mega concerts and things like this, raise as much money as possible. And they know that the path to that is like a tolerant Christianity or whatever, and so it's like, obviously, just what you have, I think, is churches who are susceptible to the world. Their loyalties are to the world. They're trying to make the gospel appeal, obviously, to the world, which is not how the gospel works and is going to fail. And in many ways is very destructive because, frankly, you are leading a lot of people to hell by doing that. But, that's where you're at. So Andrew M. Super Chat is just another example. The left controls every institution in America, including the right and also the churches. And that's so true, right? And, I think I argue in many ways neoconservatism was always designed to control to destroy the right, right? I really, maybe some random disaffected liberals came over to our 10 out of good faith, but Irving Kristol very openly says, okay, do I have actually, let me see. I think it's actually quoted in Death of the West, or if I can find it. Should I attempt to find this right now? I'm not going to do it right now, but Irving Kristol very explicitly said that this was his intention, right? To paraphrase the quote, very explicitly said that, my goal is basically to destroy tradition and to destroy the current conservative way of thinking. Literally, here's a guy who downright said that the culture war is over, the left has won it, and we should give up. Okay, he downright said that in 1992. But he said, and to paraphrase, I'm not, and I quote, but to paraphrase, outright said, my goal is to destroy current conservatism and destroy traditional conservatism and mold it into an ideology that is capable of governing a 20th century democracy. Okay, well, what does that mean? What is that a dog whistle for? That's literally a dog whistle for, my goal is to destroy the right. My goal is to destroy conservatism. This guy outright said that. And he also said he wanted to do by force. Like if you to paraphrase the quote, he said, my goal is to like force this, to take this, hijack this, and to do that, And so with that said, and we know that Irving Kristol was a Trotskyist, he's literally a communist in his youth. I would argue in many ways he never changed. I would argue in many ways he's always been the same guy and basically just understood, hey, this will be my contribution to leftism, is to literally just infiltrate conservatism and to destroy conservatism, which neoconservatism obviously was very effective at. So, Irving Kristol was literally a former quote unquote Trotskyist. That's correct. That's correct. And he outright said, my goal is to infiltrate conservatism, to hijack it away from what they want, and to turn it again into an ideology capable of governing a 20th century democracy. What the frick does that mean? What the frick that means is, the destruction of conservatism, right? It just means neoliberalism. Like, that's literally what it means. Okay. It's very true. It's very true. A lot of left-wingers infiltrate these churches by becoming elders and board members, just like all other institutions. And that's very true. That's very true. So, I think in many ways, overly progressive Christianity will fail. It's just, but, I think in many ways it's probably like the moderately progressive Christianity that's probably your biggest threat here. So, let's see. A Caesar will arise. Will you condemn Ryan for psyoping us into believing he created Vince? Hey, yeah. Hey. You don't own that. Who says Ryan owns that? It's so not true. It's so not true. Okay. All right. Let's see here. Well, we're at 1 hour. That basically wraps up for now. I'm going to make a video on this, by the way. I'm going to make a video on, like, specifically, because I know it's a very prominent phenomenon. I'm going to make a video entirely being like my address to disaffected liberals. But that wraps up kind of the disaffected liberal, the Bill Maher aspect of this. We can't watch any more of the stream because of they're literally shutting it down. So we can do Q&A. We'll react to chat. I'll probably talk about a few more things along the way. Like, I want to talk a little bit about the Ohio Senate race and things like that. But for now, let's see. Pat says, how do we infiltrate the left and psyop them epic? This is a good question. And honestly, if I'm being honest, I don't know if that will be effective. I don't know if that will honestly work, if I'm being completely realistic here, because it's like, because you need to understand something, which is like, whereas conservatism is kind of an understanding of an objective moral order, what you have with the left is just a subjective moral anarchy, right? And that's part of why it's kind of easier to psyop conservatism and infiltrate conservatism, because all you have to basically do to help the left is convince the conservative movement that, hey, that objective moral order is not so objective, right? Whereas with the left, what they want is subjective moral anarchy, which means that in many ways you can do anything, right? And it's still kind of fulfilling leftism. And so, like, yeah, you absolutely can, like, play the long march. You can play the game, infiltrate corporations, corporate America, infiltrate academia, things like this. But in terms of will you actually be able to infiltrate the left as a political movement, I don't know if that's as possible as it is with conservatives because of that reason. It's like, oh, if you promote a more radical or a more moderate form of, like, subjective moral anarchy, you're still enacting leftism. Whereas in order to hijack conservatism, all you have to do is erode an objective moral order, right? You see what I'm saying? So it's like, I know the common idea would be, hey, let's meme them, let's infiltrate them, and let's, like, be more radical than they currently are. And that's true. You can do that, and you can kind of psyop them. But at the same time, if you infiltrate the left and just say very ridiculous things, you just say, I don't know what's left to say that's really ridiculous. I don't know what's left to say. So let's but anyways, just say very hyperbolic, satirical, ridiculous things. You actually help the left in many ways, because the left is literally moving towards those unicorny, satirical, ridiculous things. So you're not actually helping conservatives by making the left seem crazier than they are. If anything, you're actually just helping normalize what the left's end goals are. On the other hand, if you infiltrate the left and try to make them more moderate, once again, like Bill Maher points out, and like we talked about Bill Maher, I don't know if that works so much either. And so what I would say is, conservatives do need to infiltrate left-wing controlled fields. That part is true. Corporations, academia, etc. But is it really possible for us to infiltrate leftism as a movement in the same way leftists do to us? I don't know if that's necessarily always so much of a possibility. Yes, you can infiltrate the Democratic Party and try to be a consultant for them and then try to make them lose the elections. I mean, I guess you can do that. But in terms of will you be able to do what Irving Kristol did, which is like become a leader in leftism and psyop leftism away, I don't know if that's necessarily possible. Because regardless of whether you're more moderate than the current left or more radical than the current left, in many ways you still help the left for that real reason, So it's just like, exactly. Here's an example, right? Hello, fellow leftists. Let's legalize public nudity next. Okay. In a sense, okay, you turn off some moderates. Yeah, great. But the left unironically wants to legalize this at some point. So are you really helping conservatives by actually helping to normalize what the left wants in the end game? You see what I'm saying here? You see what I'm saying? So that's why I'm like, I don't know if that's so possible. Now, yes, in being in a left-leaning corporation and kind of being a conservative figure in that corporation, trying to grab power, I understand that part. I support that part. I say that's what we need. But are you going to be able to psyop leftist principles away from them? Not necessarily. I don't think that's going to be as possible. It's going to be as easy. You see what I'm saying? So we need to turn liberalism into conservatism. We need to turn liberals into conservatives. But if they're still liberals, not going to be invited into our movement. This is true. This is the correct take, I would say. So Marine Le Pen, I think that's what you mean. Will promote conservatism across the globe. Listen, I understand Marine Le Pen is not as based as she was in 2017, but and I talked about this a little bit earlier with the Viktor Orban phenomenon, but I think very often what you see are kind of, it's relevant to us because we care about what happens in America, obviously. But I will remind you that in 2016, right, the first revolt against the liberal order of things, the globalists, you could say, right? In 2016, the rise in the election of Donald Trump was preceded by what? It was preceded by Brexit, right? And around the same time, Marine Le Pen was kind of coming to prominence in France, right? And I think kind of her election was in 2017 or whatever. But the point is that the West, in many ways, this is why it matters to you. The West feels the same political sentiments, right? We have that degree of sharing sentiments, okay? The same problems that engulf Europe and Canada and England, etc., very often engulf America, right? And so that's what we saw in 2016. In fact, European affairs were both a leading and lagging indicator in terms of England and France, in terms of what we saw here in America, which was the election of Donald Trump, right? Well, in that same sense, I would argue that, and honestly, pre-COVID, I thought that the kind of election of Boris Johnson, right, because the conservatives, which I understand the conservatives in Britain are not astoundingly the way they are now, but the conservatives in Britain won an overwhelming landslide election based on their support of Brexit, right? Boris Johnson's whole original pitch in early 2020 was I'm going to get Brexit done. I'll elect conservatives to get Brexit done. And they won by a massive landslide. That was before, the COPE virus or whatever. I would argue that had, those factors not been at play there and other such things, that's what Donald Trump was kind of set up for in the same sense, which is a landslide election in the 2020 election, right? That's what he was set up for in early 2020, we will say, right? And I would argue in that same sense, well, what have we seen across the West now? In Canada, we saw the trucker protest. In Hungary, we saw the overwhelming, astounding election of Viktor Orban. which I talked about on last stream. But long story short, despite a huge opposition coalition, 6 political parties joined together to stop Viktor Orban, despite the State Department and Joe Biden and the CIA funding and George Soros funding opposition movements against Viktor Orban. What happened there? Well, what happened there was Viktor Orban won an astounding re-election victory, right? And so, I would say in that same sense, and obviously now we see Zamora. Zamora, he didn't win. He got like 7%. But Marine Le Pen now set up to actually, unironically, maybe come close to upsetting Macron, right? To actually winning there. I would argue in many ways, you could view that as kind of a precursor, again, a leading indicator to maybe victories here in America. Obviously, we're set up for a big 2022 victory, but in terms of Trumpism kind of rising in America first, and America first Donald Trump rising in 2024, maybe a possibility, So we have to see that. But, like I said, it should be an optimistic thing. It should be an optimistic thing that you see stuff like this happening, So... All right. So let's see what else we got going on in chat. Tratter says, any good songs about Christ you've been listening to recently? The Man Comes Around it's been like one of my favorite, by Johnny Cash, has been one of my favorite songs recently, unironically. And I talked about this before, but long story short, I remember I first heard that song at the end of the Wolverine movie, right? At the end of Logan, they play it. And I never really understood the song. I always just thought the song was just about like a cool gunslinger or something like that. I never understood that it was actually about the book of Revelation. It was about end times. The man who comes around is Jesus. Jesus comes around to judge the world on a white horse. I obviously understand all these things now. I never understood that back then, but I remember liking that song back in the day just because I thought it sounded cool. And now I listen to that a lot and actually like internalize the lyrics there. And I like that song. I'm in the Lord's Army, which I know is a kid's song, but I heard it for the first time. Someone put me on that and I was actually like, this is actually a sick song. It's sick as in cool, obviously. And as my opinion, if I'm being honest, it shouldn't be a kid's song. That's an AstroTurf thing. Like it should actually be made into like a formally adult song. So those are 2 songs I think recently that have kind of I've been listening to a lot. Obviously there's a lot more, but you wanted 2, so there you go. There you go. Le Pencil for the win. It's so true. It's so true. I guess one thing I guess we could talk about is the Ohio Senate race. So let me see if I can pull up like an article about. Let's see. That's what we're talking about to kind of continue the stream here because Bill Maher and Joe Rogan are copyrighting us and not letting us stream. So here's what I was actually going to stream about this on Sunday, and then I canceled it because I just was like, I feel like not a lot of people care enough about our electoral talk. But since we're in like the second. Since we're in the second half of this stream here, Kat Kamek backs Mike Gibbons in the Ohio Senate. Of course she does. Of course she does. What a joke. What a freaking... I don't like Kat Kamek. But anyways. All right. Ohio GOP Senate hopeful says middle class doesn't pay fair share. So let's actually talk about the Ohio Senate race. Now, the reason why I think the Ohio Senate race is relevant and interesting to me is that I would argue in many ways what you have in terms of the primary field in Ohio is basically an embodiment of where the conservative movement is right now. Like basically you have one candidate for every faction of the conservative movement. So, you have basically, let's just go through it. You have like Jane Timken. And she is like the Lindsey Graham, Mitch McConnell type. She has shielded for Mike DeWine. She apologized for Mike DeWine locking down the state. She is total establishment GOP through and through. She is Mitch McConnell. She is a Lindsey Graham, right? She's that type of Republican. Total shill, total neocon, total establishment right now. But that's obviously one faction of the Republican Party, of the conservative movement. You have her. On the other hand, you have Josh Mandel. And I would argue that Josh Mandel is basically the embodiment of like the MAGA boomer grift. And that's basically what he is. He's kind of like a MAGA grifter, right? And so, you know, here's a guy who has changed. He changes his stance whenever. He'll say whatever to get elected or to be popular. He's a total grifter, right? He's kind of similar to Kim Klacik in that regard. He's known for these very shallow, basic tier like tweets where he'll just try to throw out stuff. He kind of just wants to be a fundraising juggernaut, et cetera, et cetera. He'll say anything to get elected. He's changed his stances many times over the years, you know, and he's just a grifter. He's a MAGA wannabe, this and that. And that's a real problem. That's a real prominence that exists in the MAGA movement, obviously, right? You have like the boomer tier MAGA grift. That's a real problem in the movement, very prominent. Well, there you go. You have Josh Mandel. He represents that side of it. And then you have Mike Gibbons. And I would say that Mike Gibbons basically represents the Tea Party, right? That's what he is. He's kind of a big-time libertarian. He's like a conservatarian. So in many ways, he's not really kind of like the Republican establishment, right? He's not one of them necessarily. You know, he's not perceived to be as bad as James Timken, et cetera, et cetera. In some ways, we consider him to be an outsider. He's solid on the issues, as many people think he is, but he's a Tea Party guy. He's a conservatarian. That obviously, likewise, is a very prominent faction within the modern conservative movement. And then we have J.D. Vance, right? And J.D. Vance, as imperfect, as flawed as many people perceive him to be, no one could deny the faction of the movement he represents in this race basically is like the national populist, the national conservative, kind of like the 2016-esque, the anti-globalist, the Americanist, kind of America first wing of the movement, right? I know a lot of people within our circles don't really like J.D. Vance, don't trust J.D. Vance, but it's undeniable reality. He's kind of our ambassador, you would say, in this race. So that's why I find it very interesting, which is that in this race, you basically, and also J.D. Vance, you could argue something of like a Trump-Obama voter, right? Which kind of is the embodiment of where the origins of kind of Ohio national populism come from, et cetera. But like, that's what you basically have in this race, okay? And so and I'll tell you why in many ways I think this race gives me optimism is the fact that originally who was in front? The guy who was originally leading in this race was Josh Mandel. And like I said, Josh Mandel is like a Kim Klacik style MAGA grifter, the type that doesn't really believe in anything, but will just shill for Trump to get elected. No principles, no spine, total grifter. Originally, he was polling in like the 40%. Originally, Josh Mandel, who again is like the Kim Klacik style grifter, originally he was winning big in the polls. What has happened since then and what gives me white pilling is number one is the fact that Josh Mandel has collapsed, right? Over time, he really slipped off in popularity. His campaign collapsed, his approval rating collapsed. Now he's in like second or third place. I think he's actually kind of now in like third place basically in this race, which number one, that gives me optimism. It really does give me a lot of optimism that kind of the base woke up to the MAGA grift. Okay, so that's number one. And then number two, what we have here is Mike Gibbons. Now, the direction that this race has gone is after kind of the initial decline of Josh Mandel, after people realize this guy's very dishonest, this is just a MAGA grifter. This guy, Mike Gibbons, rose to kind of prominence. And Mike Gibbons, like I said, is a Tea Party guy. Now, very often we look at these Tea Party guys and we're like, hey, they're solid conservatives, whatever. But Mike Gibbons has really kind of, he's kind of exposed himself over time with his libertarian, loyalties, right? And so in the last Ohio Senate debate, keep in mind, Mike Gibbons was winning. My perception of him was basically, I don't think he's as good as the issues as Vance, but he's kind of like, I don't know, a conservative who maybe I'd argue in many ways can appeal more to like the original base or to the Republican base, because my main criticism really, the biggest thing I noticed about Vance's campaign, and I think the problem I think it had for a while, besides the fact obviously that he has a checkered past, was also the fact that I thought that J.D. Vance, and I understand it because he comes from like these think tanks and whatnot, American Enterprise or whatever he was a part of before, I felt that as much as he was pitching a 2016-esque conservative, pro-Trump, nationalist message, I thought in many ways he was too kind of like big brainy for his own academic. Like I thought he just came off as being kind of pretentious in some ways, or if not pretentious, he came off as just not being able to appeal to Trump's base, right? Because the reason why Trump appealed to his base in 2016 to begin with was because he talked like a working class man. He related to you. While J.D. Vance runs a campaign that is a total mirror, basically, of the issues that Donald Trump campaigned on in 2016, I thought his problem for a very long time was that he just doesn't make him sell, you know, because he talks like this think tanky guy. He presents his campaign as kind of being something of an elite in the sense that he just like was unable to relate. And I thought in many ways, I was like, you know, Mike Gibbons is not running a campaign that's as solid on the issues as Vance does, but at least I feel like Gibbons relates more so to the Trump voter, and so I don't entirely have a problem with him losing. But since then, we've seen Gibbons totally, you know, kind of oust himself as just a totally cringe libertarian. You know, as before, I was like, yeah, he's kind of Tea Party as compared to being America First, but I'll kind of accept him. He's really just screwed himself over. I mean, in the debate, he said he does not support a federal ban on CRT. Okay. Oh, small government or whatever. And that was like checkmate one for this guy, you know. And then you have him saying this, where he's like saying that the middle class doesn't pay their fair share in taxes. And he's going to go that off the libertarian deep end, off the Tea Party deep end, that he went out here and openly said the middle class doesn't pay their fair share in taxes. It was a very cringe statement. It was a very ridiculous statement. Let's actually read from the article here. Okay, Mike Gibbons, a leading Republican Senate candidate from Ohio. Keep in mind, he was the front runner for a while. Said at a media event that the middle class don't pay any kind of fair share of income taxes. And he points out that the top 20% of earners in the United States pay 82% of federal income tax. And if you do the math, 45 to 50% don't pay any income tax. And you can see that the middle class is really not paying any kind of a fair share, depending on how you want to define it. And this is just a ridiculous statement, right? And it's very insulting. This guy's running in Ohio. This is like the white working class state, especially northeastern Ohio. I mean, this is MAGA country. These are hardworking, you know, Trump voting middle class people. If you've ever been to Ohio, I've been to rural Ohio. I've been to like Trump country. I went there like a month ago. Like, you see it. This is, you know, this is not a particularly rich place. And here he is just insulting the middle class, talking down to the middle class. You know, I understand, you know, if you want to blanketly say that taxes need to be lower, okay, I understand that. I'm fine with Republicans saying that, obviously. But this statement is just ridiculous. This is not what you should be saying. And this is frankly dishonest, too. Real American Politics actually has a video basically debunking why this is not even true, that the middle class doesn't pay their fair share. But even if hypothetically they didn't, is this where we need to be, especially in Ohio? You know, telling middle-class people, actually, you don't pay enough in taxes. Yeah, shilling for the rich people, shilling for corporations, shilling for the kind of, you know, corporate class that has robbed this country blind. And it's just like, you know, this guy's totally off the rails. You know, it's like, whereas before, I was like, I'll settle for this guy. I can't say I want to settle for Gibbons anymore. I'm openly anti-Gibbons. Like, this is just ridiculous. And the fact that he would go out and say something like this, you know, it's just, we can't have this. Okay, we can't have this. And luckily, what we've seen since then is that late in the stage of this race, J.D. Vance has been kind of the guy who's surging. Okay, and like I said, J.D. Vance is a guy who has a checkered past, right? He has problems in his past. You know, he did not support Trump in 2016. He said some cringe things back then. People still debate whether or not he can fully be trusted. We'll talk about that in a second. But, you know, what we've seen since then is J.D. Vance basically won the debate, the last Ohio Senate debate, because he was very solid. He had a very solid debate. I thought in many ways, like, he's finally figured out how to talk to voters, right? Which is a problem he had before. And then on the other hand, Josh Mandel, he's collapsed. And now Mike Gibbons is beginning to collapse too. He's really shooting himself in the foot late in the stage of this race. Mark Galen sends me $5, says, I read a statement saying the deep state wants to make the middle class a new low class. Well, this is absolutely true. I think this is absolutely true. In order to kind of enact their vision of like an administrative state, right? What the left requires and what the corporate class requires is the elimination of a strong middle class based on strong families, right? What they're trying to create is essentially kind of like a serfdom, right? A serfdom of very poor people and very rich people at the top. And that's kind of what you have. And I would argue in many ways that's kind of what the current political class is leading towards. And so I think that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. And Sam Francis in Beautiful Losers, I believe, has an essay particularly talking about that aspect of it. Aristotle talks about how to govern an effective country in kind of that sense, you need a strong middle class, and I think that's kind of the reason why we see doing that. So, anyways, so what we're seeing late in the race, and I've heard reportedly even Trump may even come around to endorsing JD Vance. And so look, here's what I will say, because I understand that there is still kind of this distrust of JD Vance on our side. A few things I will say is, first and foremost, we've had some limited interaction with the guy. I'm of the opinion, more or less, that, I think a lot of our concerns about him have been rectified. Okay. And to a certain point, it's like, how much does JD Vance have to do to prove to you that he genuinely has ideologically changed from what he was before? Here's a guy who literally, after Marjorie Taylor Greene spoke at AFPAC, JD Vance was grilled on it. And he said that about Marjorie Taylor Greene, I'm not in this disavowing game. I'm not going to disavow anything. Frankly, she did nothing wrong. And, it's like for the AF people who are like still like how much more could you ask of a guy who's running for a U.S. Senate here? You see what I'm saying? At a certain point, I feel like a lot of these people have to, grow up and say, look, I know we have these problems, but more or less, okay, I don't know what else more you want JD Vance to do to prove to you he's not like the subversive guy that you think he is necessarily. I mean, quite frankly, he actually took a huge political risk doing that. And, it's like, whatever, right? Like, I don't know what some of these people want at this point. But at the same time, let's be realistic about this, actually. Let me say this secondly. Does anyone genuinely believe that JD Vance, right? Because I understand JD Vance has like this past or whatever. Okay, I get it. Does anyone genuinely believe, especially with the campaign that JD Vance is running right now, does anyone genuinely believe that he's going to get into office and just be like Mitt Romney 2.0? Does anyone believe that? Or is really the bigger concern is that what this guy will do is get into office and be mildly disappointing? Okay, he'll be a mild disappointment. And it's like, compare the campaign that JD Vance is running right now, which is totally solid on the issues. Okay, what's the worst case scenario you get from JD Vance? The worst case scenario, I would argue, is basically you get another Josh Hawley, right? The ceiling on JD Vance is very high. I think that you can get something very good out of him if he plays all the cards right. But the very worst, I would argue, the very floor we get from JD Vance is like Josh Hawley 2.0. And is that really, yeah, I get it. We want better than that. But is that like at this point where he's the best candidate left in the race, is that really such a bad thing? It's not the best thing, but I'm also not saying this guy's going to be the savior of American populism or something like that. All I'm saying is I think he has the potential, or he will just get into office and be one of the better senators. Whereas I absolutely do think that someone like Mike Gibbons or Josh Mandel or obviously Jane Timken, I do think that these people absolutely have the potential to get into office and be Lindsey Graham levels of bad, and I think they will. At least out of Vance, the worst case scenario you get is kind of a decent conservative senator. Is that really such a bad thing, especially when we're left at the point in this race where we really don't have that much better options? So, that's what I would say. But what I will lastly say to people who just, despite the fact that JD Vance is running a campaign totally solid on the issues, and I think he's done a lot of things along the way to prove to you, hey, you actually can, at least moderately to an extent, trust the guy. I'm not saying you totally trust him 100%. At least the fact that he's just not totally subversive. He's not a total grifter in this race, right? The last thing I would say is revert back to the fact that this really is a battle between all the ideological divides in the party. Again, like I said earlier, Timken is the GOP establishment. Timken is the McConnell types. Timken is the Lindsey Graham types. Timken is Kevin McCarthy in a nutshell, okay? So you have that. Mike Gibbons is the Tea Party. Josh Mandel is like the boomer tier MAGA grift. And Vance, again, even if you think he's an imperfect ambassador, he is the populist. He is the 2016 Trumpian conservative. He is the Americanist over globalist. He is the nationalist. He's the national conservative. He is the national populist, right? I would argue it is objectively, in many ways, a good thing for the Overton window and is a good thing for our movement if our ideology, even if Vance is not the perfect ambassador of it, I would argue that it is objectively a good thing that our ideology beats out every other faction in the conservative movement to win the Senate race. Like, I don't care what you say. I have to argue in many ways, like, that's objectively a good thing. That's a good thing for the Overton window. In many ways, even if Vance isn't the perfect senator, which I'm not saying he will be. I think he has the potential to be a very good senator, by the way. But in the case that he's not, doesn't pan out to be perfectly who we wanted him to be, I would argue it's still a good thing, because what it does is set into stone. It gives a degree of legitimacy to our ideas. Hey, look, we have this very crowded primary of different ideologies. Our ideology won. In many ways, I would argue that gives the legitimacy, that gives the ground to stand on for us to ultimately get people better than JD Vance throughout kind of the Republican primaries in the future, throughout the Republican Party. In many ways, JD Vance winning would validate America First as a political force within the Republican Party. And I think long term, what that opens the door for are like a lot better things. And honestly, what's the alternative? The alternative is Mike Gibbons. Okay, that's what you get. You get Mike Gibbons, who thinks that the middle class is not paying their fair share in taxes. You get Josh Mandel, who is a grifter, or you get James Timken, who is literally a Mike DeWine, Mitch McConnell apologist, or you get JD Vance, who, although imperfect, is kind of the ambassador of the original Trump movement, is the ambassador of America First, whether you like it or not. He's the only guy left to do that, and will validate our movement and our ideology as being a viable political force, okay? Because the fact that people maybe don't understand the way politics works, but I'll just say the fact that in a jungle primary of a very diverse field of candidates, I would argue the fact that our ideology, the America First guy out of it all, wins that primary, even if he's not the perfect guy. I think long-term, the legitimacy that will give to our movement and kind of the ground to stand on, the foundation that will give to our movement, in the same way Donald Trump winning the Republican primary and winning the 2016 election kind of gives us that ground to stand on. I think that foundation is very good for us, and it's an objectively good thing for us. And that foundation gives us the chance to build a lot better things. No, I'm not saying JD Vance at his current state is the perfect guy to ever exist. What I'm saying is that I think that him winning, especially the circumstance in which he would win, number one, I think he has the potential, like I said, to at least be a decent senator, if not a pretty good senator. But number two, even if he's kind of a disappointment, like I said, the most important takeaway I would argue from this race, and the most important thing we could get out of JD Vance winning, is specifically kind of the foundation for us to have a kind of credibility in terms of our ideology, and to build up a better political movement with better leaders based on the fact that someone like JD Vance beat out all the other types of conservatives within this movement to validate our movement, you know? And so people can come after me all they want. They can call me a JD Vance shill, whatever they want, but I think my take is fully rational. Quite frankly, I think takes to the contrary who are still like, JD, oh no, I'm a never Vancer. Like people like that, I think, quite frankly, it's just irrational. You know, it's irrational in many ways. You could say it's ego-driven, like it's immature. You know, I think that my view of this, my take on this is basically correct. I'm not soy jacking on the other side either. You know, I'm not saying JD Vance is going to save America, JD Vance 2024. I'm not saying any of these things. What I'm saying is, as imperfect as Vance is, I think a Vance victory actually does a good thing for us. I laid out the legitimate, viable reasons why. And I also laid out the legitimate, viable reasons why I don't think Vance is the great devil antichrist that you think he is. And so really at this point, it's just a matter of, are you willing to be kind of mature about this and be like long-sighted about this? Not in terms of, oh, ego. Vance said Vance was a never Trumper in 2016, so let's cast him out. Or are you willing to think long-term about this and say, like, realistically, here's the net positive we get out of a JD Vance victory in Ohio. Here's the net negative. And quite frankly, the net positive far outweighs the net negative. I'm not going crazy over the guy. I'm not schizo going out. JD Vance this, JD Vance that. I'm just saying, I think that in a battle of ideologies, which fundamentally the Ohio race is, it's an objectively good thing that our ideology beats out the MAGA grift, which was Josh Mandel, and it beats out the Tea Party, which is Mike Gibbons, and it beats out, just the GOP establishment, which is Jane Timken, okay? So, that's the way I see it. And honestly, realistically, look at how bad the current Ohio GOP is, which, I mean, it's kind of a paradox, right? And Jonathan, your comment is very true, right? Jonathan says, I mean, JD Vance is going to be a solid conservative, in my opinion, as awful as the rest of the conservative movement is, he's one of the best in Ohio, and this is so true. If you want to reshape the Ohio GOP, because here's the way I see it, right? The states that kind of Trump flipped in 2016, that white working class, the forgotten people, forgotten men and women of America, right? The middle American radical, as Sam Francis talks about in the 1990s, right? Theoretically, these states should be the states with the most Trumpian style GOPs, okay? Obviously, the South, Texas, the Bible Belt, we want to get the best out of that we can out of them as possible as well. Florida, stuff like that too, obviously. But in theory, the most kind of like populist GOPs should be out of the states that Trump built his movement upon, right? Trump built his movement primarily out of kind of a rise to power in that Midwest. Hypothetically, the Midwest and the Midwest GOP should be home to, you know, the most Trumpian, the most America first, the most populist conservatives, and the most populist Republican parties. There's a paradox because it's not. Mike DeWine is one of the worst Republican governors in this country. The Ohio Republican coalition is terrible. Pennsylvania is home to what? Pat Toomey, you know? That's who we get out of Pennsylvania. We get Pat Toomey. He was an awful senator, you know. And really fundamentally, I think it's common sense reshaping these Midwestern GOPs to really reflect their voters. Because let's be honest, the most pro-Trump voters are of the Republicans are up there. It's like Northeastern Ohio, that's MAGA country. These are the people who are most philosophically in line with the Trump movement. They should have GOPs that reflect that. They should have America first, pro-working class GOPs. Like that's what they should get. And they don't have that. Well, you got to start somewhere, okay? And, you know, I think having the fact, because look at how much Ron DeSantis, for instance, has changed the political identity and the Republican identity of the state of Florida. It's been tremendous. It's been enormous. You know, obviously he hasn't done everything, but think of how you perceive Florida to be now, and Trump to an extent moving to Florida and making a big deal out of Florida too. Let's not forget, before, Florida was the state primarily that was known for Rick Scott, who was a rhino, he sucks, of Marco Rubio, of Jeb Bush, right? That was the GOP of old. We're still in the process of getting rid of that here in Florida. But look at what DeSantis, look at what Trump has done, right? We need to get the ball rolling on that in states like Ohio. Okay, and that's the truth. Okay, and so I would argue in many ways it is incumbent that Mike DeWine be voted out of office, which is kind of an uphill battle, unfortunately, in Ohio. But we get Mike DeWine out, and we get kind of solid America First ideological people like J.D. Vance. Even if you don't fully trust them or like them, you have to get the ball rolling on this. We have to reshape these GOPs, and where we have the chance to literally have one half of the Republican Senate delegation be kind of somewhat of an ambassador, specifically not just for like good conservatism, but specifically for 2016 conservatism, specifically for pro-Trump, white working class appealing conservatism. Where you have the chance to do that, you absolutely have to take it. You know, what are you going to do? Wait till 2028 to get the ball rolling on this? I mean, we need the Ohio GOP to start something here. And I would argue the fact that J.D. Vance is 1/3 of the political identity of the Ohio GOP, because let's be honest, I guess you have Jim Jordan too. I'll point him out too. But the identity and kind of the future of a state's GOP is really formed by who the governor is and who the senators are there. And you have to get started somewhere. You know, if you want these Midwestern states to really be what they should, which they're not right now, you got to get it started somewhere. And in my opinion, J.D. Vance is more than qualified to do that. Yeah, sure, he's not perfect. Yeah, sure, we don't fully trust him. But he will get the ball rolling. He will slowly change the identity of that Ohio GOP. And in my opinion, you cannot wait till like 2028 or the next election cycle to just hope that someone better comes along. Like, let's get the ball started. Let's get started somewhere. And J.D. Vance, in my opinion, more than meets the threshold to do that, you know? What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Just, I mean, this is what most of these people want to do. These people just want to sit on their butts and complain and just purity spiral and argue that the people we have currently are not good enough. And look, I understand that. I am not a fan of just like incrementalism entirely. I understand that we do have to have an America First revolution. My point is that in terms of what we want and what we have at the moment and our current options, JD Vance to me seems more than like the viable guy to at least get something started in Ohio. Even if he's not perfect, you know what he does? People look to Ohio, voters look to Ohio and say, look, we have JD Vance. He's something of this national populist. I will grow to expect that out of Ohio, right? Because that's the thing. Let's look at Ron DeSantis here in Florida, for instance. Ron DeSantis has changed the Republican cultural identity here in Florida. Floridians in the future will expect their future Republicans to be as good as Ron DeSantis, because Ron DeSantis was kind of he's the model, right? Well, if you don't get started somewhere in Ohio, when are you ever going to start that, right? Because I would argue if you get JD Vance into office, what you will get over time is kind of this demand, this expectation from Republican voters that like, hey, we're Ohio. We're like this white working class state. We're the original Trump country. We expect our Republican officials to reflect that. And look, JD Vance is one of those guys, more or less. And so in the future, I would argue you put Vance there. Over time, he will kind of incite a more a movement towards that being what Ohio is like, that being reflected in Ohio. Whereas if you sit here in purity spiral and you put Mike Gibbons into office, who's a Tea Party guy or whatever, what you're going to get is the political and cultural relevancy of our movement in Ohio, which is where it should be the most important and where it should be most prominent. It's going to wane, or at the very least, it's not going to grow as fast as it should be and as fast as we need it to be. So, like, long story short here, I don't think there really is, from our perspective, from the America First perspective, from the national populist perspective, in terms of the candidates who are available, in terms of what we have left, in terms of where we're at, in terms of what JD Vance has proved he is and he's not, in terms of just the ideological battle, the Overton window battle between the ideological factions of the movement that are at stake here. In many ways, I would argue, like, what are you going to do? Like, what is the case really not to vote for Vance at this point? I don't think there's a strong one. I think that it's going to be a good thing for Ohio in long term. Even if JD Vance isn't the perfect senator, it's a good thing long term that we get the ball rolling on kind of the reshaping of the political identity of a state. It should be the most Trumpian America First GOP in the country, theoretically. So we get the ball rolling on that. And then number two, it's a very good thing that our ambassador, right, our movement beat out all the other sub-movements in the conservative movement, okay? It's a good thing. And I think anyone who really thinks otherwise, I would just say, I don't think you're thinking long-term about this. I think it's kind of a shallow-minded, I mean, in many ways, I'd say, frankly, immature almost line of thinking there, you know? So Ohio, South Carolina, and Utah are now fighting over who gets to have the most gay GOP. It's so true. And it's just like, look, you understand how strong the political... people say, why is it so bad? You know, it shouldn't be that bad, but also understand, if you want to reshape these GOPs over time, you're really fighting against a political machine. It's not as easy as it may seem. It should be easy, but you have to overcome that. And to the extent to which we have someone like Vance who, you know, at the very least, he may not entirely be like us, according to you, but at least he's not like the rest of them, right? I would argue that in many ways, you need to get the ball rolling. Like, if you have this opportunity with someone like Vance, take it. Even if he's not the perfect senator, take it. Over time, I would argue him sitting there, even if it's not perfect, he will be the catalyst of a reshaping of the Ohio GOP. Okay, which over time, maybe it'll be a bunch of Chads running the state of Ohio, but you got to start somewhere. I mean, you really do. In the same sense that Ron DeSantis is starting something here in Florida. Hopefully it's not the end. You have to start somewhere. I mean, that's the truth, you know? So Mike and Spencer Cox are two of the worst governors ever. It's so true. And Ass Hutchinson, or Asa Hutchinson, or Asa Hutchinson. I don't know how you say his name. I mean, that's just so true. One of the worst, truly one of the worst. So that's my take on this Ohio Senate race. Okay. You can call me a shill, whatever you want. I think JD Vance is the logical pick here. Okay. I really do, at this stage in the race, especially. I mean, what are you going to do? Someone who's against Vance still, give me like a viable alternative solution, okay? And if you're just saying surrender the Ohio Senate race to the Tea Party, which is what Mike Gibbons is, give me a viable reason, give me like a viable plan in terms of how that's going to be good for us, how that's going to in the long term work out better for us. I don't think it makes a lot of logical sense, quite frankly. I mean, I really don't. So, you know, it is what it is. I know there will be people who will not be happy with me saying to vote for Vance. It's just a militant opposition to him but you know, it is what it is. I'm sick of pretending. I'm sick of actually just like being scared of these people or having to like pretend that this is not my honest. I'm gonna give my honest opinion. This is my honest opinion, you know. So that's where we're at. You know, it's like this, and this is you don't vote for Vance because of his checkered past, which I will admit is a problem. This is what you get, you know? And I think that's what you're seeing. And I think that's part of why Vance is really gaining steam in the Ohio Senate races, because when in the beginning of the race, Vance has the biggest baggage besides like James Timken, right? Right, because he has all these bad things he said in the past. He was kind of like an anti-Trumper in his past. But what you've seen along the way is people like Mike Gibbons, people who you perceive to be like the good ones, right? Now you're seeing these other candidates have a checkered present, okay? Josh Mandel has been outed as a grifter. He literally tried to start a fist fight on stage. And Mike Gibbons is saying this about the middle class on this campaign trail, right? And so, well, J.D. Vance has a checkered past. Yeah, well, the rest of the Ohio candidates have a checkered present. And you look at the campaign trail, J.D. Vance has run an incredibly solid campaign on the issues. Like I said, I've had some criticisms of its messaging in the sense that I feel like, and I feel like it's gotten better, but I feel like originally it had problem appealing to really the MAGA base, that MAGA culture war, right? But regardless, right? Regardless, you want to talk about checkered past. Well, what you're voting for is a checkered present. I mean, these people are outwardly coming out and saying this nonsense. You know, this is what you enable if you stand on the Vance hill because of his checkered past. And it's like, you know, I think in many ways he's more than answered for that. But it's you know, it's just whatever. You know, what are you gonna do? I mean, realistically, what are you gonna do? You know. And I feel that Vance has, frankly, on this campaign trail, done more than enough to prove that he's not like the grifter many of you think he is. And he's really, frankly, taken some moral stands that he didn't have to take. And really, it was meant to appeal to people like us, meant to prove something to people like us. And you can take it or you can leave it. But, you know, like I said, I would argue that there's a strong case to be made that for the reasons I listed out, for like rational reasons I listed out, you want this guy to win, okay? So it is what it is, honestly. He's the best candidate in Ohio right now, and it's so true. By far, it's not close. It's not close. The other candidates all suck, and that includes Mike Gibbons, okay? That includes Mike Gibbons, who is awful. You know, like this is what you're going to get. Is this what the Ohio GOP should, you know, Ohio, the working class state, the state of working class populism, you know? Tea Partyism has no place in this state, you know what I mean? You know, it's stupid, so... You know, it is what it is. It really is what it is. But at this point, it looks like Vance is going to win. You know, Mandel collapsed. Gibbons collapsed. Timken really never got off the ground to begin with. I think a lot of people didn't like her to start with. Vance is surging. He's surging at the right time, right? In the beginning, You see, everyone had their respective moment of glory. Vance is coming at the right time because the primary is coming up, right? And so, you know, and like I said, I think a big problem is because early on in the campaign, his baggage was the big talk of the day. But then that's kind of faded a little bit because we've had this campaign season and he's run a fairly, it's gotten better. Like I said, I didn't think the messaging was on point in terms of appealing to Trump voters. That's gotten better over time, though. In terms of issues, he's run a good campaign this whole time. And now what you're seeing is the collapse of the rest of them. And that's just leaving J.D. Vance as the only one left standing. If Trump endorses Vance, it's a lock. This race is over. That's probably going to happen. And even I think without the Trump endorsement, if Trump stays neutral in this race, I think Gibbons has collapsed to the point where Vance is going to be the front runner regardless. And so that's where we're at. And so understanding that's where we're at, I mean, you can stand here and keep saying the same thing to me, but you know, assuming he is going to win, let's at least admit that this is the good that can come out of that. Can we be mature enough to do that at least? I don't know, but it is what it is. Jonathan said, I mean, if there's a based guy out of nowhere that is phenomenal on the issues, I would be endorsing that guy, but unfortunately that guy is not there. So I'll be endorsing JD Vance. Well, I think Vance, I think compared to what you get out of most Republicans and what kind of the state where we're at incrementally in terms of making our movement mainstream, I think Vance is very solid on the issues. Vance is the only Vance is probably the most conservative major GOP Senate candidate in this whole cycle of major ones I can think of, right? Because he's actually slightly more conservative, I've noticed, on the issues than even like Blake Masters is, right? His problem is his baggage, right? His problem is his past, this or that, okay? But in terms of the platform he's running, he's really the only guy who's talked about legal immigration extensively. He talks specifically about, how reducing and cutting back on legal immigration. That's number one. He is the only guy who doesn't talk in vague platitudes about big tech and actually thinks that, take action against them. He has been very open about standing up for like the political persecution of Jan 6 conservatives, et cetera, et cetera. Like, in terms of what you expect out of a regular GOP Senate candidate, I understand he's not as far based as everyone wants him to be right now. Okay, well, understand in this stage of our country, we're still in the process of like solidifying our movement in politics. And so you're not going to get a full-blown everything you want. But in terms of the issues, Vance has run a very solid campaign on the issues. The only issue is like, his past or whatever. But like I said, I think he's more than an answer to that. I think, we've seen that. And so, yes, if there's a base guy out of nowhere that has no baggage, yeah, we'd vote for him. But considering right now what we basically have out of Vance is a based guy with a lot of baggage around him, well, every other candidate has baggage. The only difference is Vance at least agrees with us on most of the issues, and the rest of them hate us and hate our movement. And you think the middle class isn't paying enough in taxes and think Mitch McConnell should be, the majority leader or whatever. Well, I think the choice is pretty clear, so that's what you get. I mean, the past is in the past. I mean, Trump had a past as well. I don't think the past should be totally disregarded, not in the sense that people can't genuinely change. I mean, as a Christian, I would be very hypocritical to say, well, if you ever did anything wrong in the past, I don't trust you. But in the sense of politics, like, yeah, you absolutely do have to look out for grifting and dishonesty. But at the same time, some things I would say also about Vance's past is that while he's not always been a national conservative like he is now, he has been always something of a populist, right? He always had this kind of populist ideology. It's just more so that before he had kind of like this Andrew Yang head style populism and shifted to what it is now. And so it's not like he's a total liberal before and became a conservative. It's more so he subscribed to a different brand of populism. My understanding is in 2019, he became a Catholic. He kind of came around to like, Trumpian populism as compared to his like old brand of like whatever populism before. And I'll also point this out, he's a young guy. The guy's in his 30s, okay? Which is not to say, and the thing is, the reason I point that out is because when we're young, our ideas change at a quicker rate than as when we're old. As we grow older, we become more stubborn, we become more set in our ways. And so if he was like 60 years old and he totally changes his mind at like 64 years old, yeah, I'd look at that a little bit like, but this is still a young guy. Ask yourself, most of you guys are probably like 18 or whatever. I know I'm like 18, almost 19. Ask yourself where you were 4 years ago. 4 years ago, I was barely just coming around to being like a Trump supporter or whatever. And I know ideologically, I was way more left wing as compared to where I am now, right? Now, JD Vance is in his 30s, so obviously there's a little bit more time there. But the point is, still a young guy. Is it so hard to believe that a guy who's rather young can undergo somewhat of an ideological transformation, especially if that coincides a conversion to Christianity? Like the idea that this guy, it's impossible that JD Vance ever had an ideological transformation. I don't know if it's necessarily accurate. So I'm not saying it shouldn't be a concern. I definitely think it is something that should be addressed, looked at, questioned. But like I said, I think in many ways he's more than answered to those things. Okay, so I don't know what people want at this point. If I'm being totally honest. So, anyways, that wraps up this discussion. We'll go to Q&A. We'll go to full on Q&A now. We'll talk to the chat entirely, and so I'll put that up on the members tab, and so I'm going to transition right anyways, if you're watching on the replay, I'll say that if you're watching on the replay, I'm going to cut it off here. Don't go anywhere if you're watching on the live chat, because we're going to continue the stream. But if you're watching on the replay, be sure to become a member to see the full live stream replays, and if not, I'm going to transition to the end of the stream and I'll see you guys there. So whoosh. Anyways, guys, I'm going to wrap up the stream here, but you know, if you're in the Georgia area, I'll be speaking at Emory University this Friday. Driving there, it's gonna be a fun road trip. I would fly there, but the mask mandate is still in place, and it's just getting ridiculous. And I have the option to drive. It's not pleasant, but you know, at least it's only like 5 hours and not like 2 days. So I'm gonna drive up there. I'll see you guys there. I know it's Good Friday. It's scheduling problems. I know it wasn't supposed to be on that day, but it is. But in that honor, I will be giving a speech that is centered around Christianity. Okay, it won't be like a literal like Bible study of Good Friday or whatever, but you know, because I am still speaking for a Republican chapter, but we'll be about the relationship between like Christianity and conservatism, and you know, kind of the Christian foundations of America, Christian nationalism. That'll be the topic of the speech. Be a great speech. If you're in the Atlanta, Georgia area, come out to the speech. Will be a fun time. So yeah. Anyways, guys, I'll see you guys later. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I had to say. No, actually, just be sure to leave a like on the stream before you guys go. If this is the last time I see you, have a great Good Friday. Have a happy Easter weekend. God bless. Remember, he is risen. Okay? Remember what Easter is about, too. It's not about a bunny. It's literally about the resurrection of the Son of God. It's so true. But yes, see you guys later. Alpha moves only. God bless and peace.
In leaving it, I do so with this prayer. May God's grace be with you in all the days ahead.
He is a globalist, and we are nationalists. He believes in some Pax Universalis. We believe in the old republic. He would put America's wealth and power at the service of some vague new world order. We will put America first. So today we call for a new patriotism, where Americans begin to put the needs of Americans first. For a new nationalism, where in every negotiation, be it arms control or trade, the American side seeks advantage and victory for the United States. And the people of this country need to recapture our capital city of Washington from lobbyists and registered agents of foreign powers who are hired to look out for everybody and everything except the national interest of the United States. And our Western heritage is going to be handed down to future generations and not dumped onto some landfill called multiculturalism.